Hello everybody. As promised, I finally have a sourdough video for you guys and I'm answering all your questions, but I have one huge favor to ask you guys. Usually when I do videos dedicated to one subject, they don't do very well, so I'm wondering if you could help me. Could you share this video with your friends, your family, in your sourdough groups, and anywhere you think that this video would be appreciated? That would help me so much. All right, you guys, let's dive in and we are going to start at the very beginning. We're going to start with making your sourdough starter. There's an easy way and there's a hard way to do this. Now, when I started many years ago, almost 20 to be exact, I started the hard way and I started with just flour and water. And although you can do it that way, I don't recommend it, especially if you are a beginner. It's too easy for foreign and unhealthy bacteria to take over the starter. And if you don't know what you're looking for, that can be a bad thing. What I do recommend doing is getting a culture. You can get cultures off of Amazon. You can get them from Azure Standard. I will link to some of my favorite ones in the description box below. So far, one of my top favorites is the San Francisco style sourdough starter culture. When you are starting sourdough with any culture, you guys, it just couldn't be easier. They even come with instructions. Just simply open the package and follow the instructions. For this particular starter, I'm supposed to add 1 packet of starter to 1 tablespoon flour and a tablespoon of room temperature water. And of course, we put this into a jar. About 10 years ago, I couldn't figure out why I was having so much trouble getting my sourdough starter started. And I found out it was because I was using tap water. You do not want to use tap water because tap water can have chlorine, which kills the starter. Tap water can also contain other bacteria depending on your water source. And depending what's in the water, it can interact with your bacteria and can completely kill it. So distilled or filtered water is the best to use. Something that's really important is the temperature of your house. The optimal temperature is between 70 and 80, but I find that the closer to 80, the better, especially when you are trying to establish a good starter. What you're looking for is bubbles. If after a few days you don't see some of these happy bubbles in here, then it means your starter is simply not doing what it's supposed to be doing, and you should probably discard it and start over. Most common reasons that your sourdough starter doesn't take off and start creating the bubbles, which means the bacteria is working, is because of either bad water or it's just been too cold in your house. If your house is too cold, you can either set it by a heat source or get yourself a yogurt starter. Yogurt starters are great for getting sourdough starter established. So now let's talk about feeding. Your starter should come with instructions on feeding for the first few days. You want to feed your sourdough starter every 12 to 24 hours. When you are starting to get a sourdough starter established, the more often you feed it, so the closer to that 12-hour mark, it seems like the better, especially if it's warm. If it's not very warm, then you don't need to feed it that often. But the more you feed it and the warmer it is, the faster your sourdough will get established. So when I started this sourdough, I had a tablespoon of flour and a tablespoon of water. So the first feeding would be 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water. And then you would stir that and let it sit 12 to 24 hours, and after 12 to 24 hours you would feed it even more, so a 1/4 cup of flour and a 1/4 cup of water. Again, stir thoroughly, let it sit 12 to 24 hours. After that 12 to 24 hours, you would feed it a 1/2 cup of flour and a 1/2 cup of water. Again, wait another 12 to 24 hours. Hopefully by this point you're starting to see a bubble or two. Generally, this is the point in time when people start doing discard. I personally have never done the discard, but most of the reason for that is because we are a big family and I need a large quantity of sourdough starter. If you do not need a large quantity of sourdough starter, you can discard a 1/2 cup of the starter at this point. And for the next 3 to 7 days, you would continually discard 1/2 cup of starter and then feed the starter that you're keeping 1/2 cup of flour and 1/2 cup of water. Again, what you're looking to do is feed this starter so that it starts aggressively bubbling. I started using sourdough 18 years ago. I started it when my oldest was a baby. And in all of these years, I've never done the sourdough discard. Yet I have huge loaves of bread. I'm going to be really honest with you. Until recently, I didn't even know what the sourdough discard thing was. I had to look it up. I'll be very honest with you. My first thought when I saw that people actually throw the discard away was just shock. of course, as a bigger family mama, I try not to let too much go to waste. When you are first building up a sourdough, like from the time you get your start in the mail, or if somebody gives you a start, that's different. But if you've done the sourdough starter where you've purchased a start and you are starting from absolute scratch, yeah, you do need to feed it every single day. However, you do not need to continue feeding it every single day once you have a good, healthy sourdough starter. And you'll know you have a good, healthy sourdough starter when you fed it, you've waited maybe 8 to 24 hours, somewhere in there, and you've seen it get super bubbly and start to double in size. It will take you some time to learn how much you're going to use at a time. For example, I can take 10 cups of sourdough starter and make breads. I can make all kinds of things for the whole week, like cinnamon rolls and cinnamon bread. I also do specialty breads where I wrap cheeses in them. You know, we're a larger family, so we will go through 10 cups of sourdough start a week. If you're a smaller family or just one person though, you can probably set aside maybe a half of a cup of sourdough starter and then just revive that when you're ready to use it. You won't have 10 cups that way, of course. You can build it up to 10 cups if you're going to end up using that. So essentially, when you're ready to use it, pull it out, build it up to a quantity that you know you're going to use. Once you've got it fed that very last time, take a cup out, put it back in the fridge, let what's remaining do the rising and the doubling, and then use that. You don't have to feed your sourdough starter fresh ground flour, but I do find that the warm, freshly ground flour and warm water does help the sourdough starter to take off much more quickly than it would if I was using cold flour and cold water. Here are some clips of some extremely happy sourdough starter. Look at those bubbles. This is the natural yeast, friends, and this is what you are looking for. When you feed your sourdough starter and it doubles or almost doubles, that's when you know it's ready to use for bread. Here are some less happy shots, but still happy shots. This is a much younger and less established, so less mature sourdough starter. Once you get it to this stage though, you can start storing it in your refrigerator, and when you do that, you do not have to feed it as often. If you're going to be baking a lot and you want to leave your sourdough starter on the counter because of that, you would feed it much more often. If you're going to do that, you would also probably want to do discard depending on how much you're going to use. If you're going to be baking less often, you can just store it in your refrigerator. So what I like to do is I keep it in the refrigerator once or twice a week. I bring it out and I feed it. After I feed it, I let it double, and then I will do a huge, big baking day. I will mix up 5 to 10 batches of bread, and then I will store that bread in the refrigerator and use it through the week. I personally like to do it this way because the bread has fermented longer and it has gotten more easily digestible in the process, and that is the biggest reason I do sourdough, is for the health purposes. So the longer your actual bread is fermenting, the more the bacteria and enzymes are working to essentially pre-digest a lot of that gluten and wheat. So after you pull your sourdough out of the fridge, it'll be dormant, and to wake it up, feed it, put it in a warm spot or a warm bowl of water and let it double, and you're ready to go. This sourdough has doubled. I got it out this morning. It was right about here when I got it out this morning. So I want to say there was maybe 3 cups of sourdough. I haven't fed it in 5 or 6 days. And so we got it out to feed it this morning. I double fed it, so I had about 3 cups of starter, so I fed it about 3 cups of feed. After I fed it, it was about to right in here, I want to say. I don't know if you could see on the camera, so it was about to right in here. It is now more than double. It's up to here. Again, I only feed this once a week, maybe twice a week. I'm ready to use this now. We're gonna make pizza crust with this. We're going to make maybe some crackers, several loaves of bread. What I like to do is I like to make 5 or 6 loaves of bread at a time. Just put them in a container and keep them in the fridge. I would like to point out that there are a variety of feeding methods. There are a variety of recipes of what to feed the starter and ways to feed the starter. You can take it out the night before, feed it, let it rise overnight. A lot of times I find that it over doubles and starts to go back down when I do that, but some people find it works best for them. The point is there's a variety of ways to do this, and they all work. Some things work better for different households depending on the temperature of the house, how much you're feeding your sourdough. Sourdough really is simple. I feel like a lot of people make it more complicated than it really is and that it needs to be. One thing that I have learned to watch out for is the people that usually make it really complicated are either selling a book about it that they want you to buy, or they read a book that had a lot of extra terminology and complicated steps in order to make it more convincing and sellable. But the truth is, it's really not that complicated. I will say it is easier to learn sourdough if you start out by learning how to make regular yeast bread. Yeast bread is much easier than sourdough. So if you learn how to successfully make a couple loaves of regular yeast bread, you will have an advantage when you go to learn how to do the sourdough. Let's talk about how much to actually feed the starter. What I have here is a super healthy, super bubbly sourdough starter. I fed it last night. I have approximately, let's see how many cups I have here. 5 cups. I have exactly 5 cups. This is a lot. So since there's 5 cups, I'm going to feed it 5 cups feed. So I've got about 2.5 cups of water. I put about 2.5 cups of flour in here. And of course that's gonna not make quite 5 cups, but it's gonna be close enough. I'm gonna just mix it up, not too much, because I do not want the gluten to really activate, and if I over stir this, the gluten's gonna activate and it won't make as bubbly and healthy a starter as I would like. At least in my experience, that's been the case. So now I'm gonna mix the starter and my feed together, and I'm gonna stir it up, and then I'm gonna take 1 cup of this and I'm gonna save it. Actually, I probably better take 2 cups, and I'm gonna save 2 cups of this in the fridge for the next time. And it's gonna sit there for about a week until I'm ready to make more bread, until baking day comes again. That's how I do it. I don't feed this stuff every single day. I don't have discarder every single day. I just simply feed it when I need to use it. Sometimes I start the day before if I have a lot I want to bake. Okay, so I have 2 cups of starter here. I'm gonna put this in the fridge, and next week when I need it, I'm gonna pull it out. I do a lot of baking, so again, this is a lot. So if you don't do as much, maybe you would just need 1 cup of starter. But next week, what I'm gonna do is, since there's 2 cups, I'm gonna pull it out of the fridge. I'm gonna feed it a cup of water and a cup of flour. So then I will have 4 cups, and then I'm going to let it rise. Once it rises, I will look and see how much it's come to, which if it's 4 cups, it should almost double. If I've got 4 cups that I have just fed, it should double, and then I can either take a cup out for the next baking session, or I can feed it again. If I have 8 cups though, and I want to feed it again, I would feed it 4 cups of water and 4 cups of flour. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in the fridge, and this I'm going to put back in here and let it rise. And later on today, once it's doubled, I'm going to do my baking with it. I'm going to use it all up. My basic bread recipe, it's only a few ingredients. I do not weigh things out. I simply use 1 cup of sourdough starter, 1 cup of warm water, 2 teaspoons of salt, about 1/4 of a cup of sugar, but you could use less. And then I add shortening or butter or oil. For sandwich bread and for tortillas, I like to use more. For tortillas and for naan or pita bread, I have been known to use up to 1/2 a cup of shortening because it makes them more pliable. For sandwich bread, you could use as little as 2 tablespoons though. If you're making pizza crust, you don't have to use any at all. If I'm making a nice dinner loaf that I want to be more airy and have more holes in it, I will use 3 cups of flour. For most other purposes though, I use 3.5 to 4 cups of flour. The next step is to combine everything and make sure it's thoroughly mixed. After that, there are 2 different ways you can go about the next step at this stage. You have choices at this stage to knead or stretch and fold, and it kind of depends on what you intend to do with the bread as for what to do. So if you're making sandwich bread, bagels, or cinnamon rolls, kneading is great, and I like to use my KitchenAid to knead. Kneading generally produces a tighter crumb, which is why it's great for things like bagels and sandwich bread. Kneading takes up to 10 minutes in the KitchenAid on speed 1. Essentially what you're looking for is a nice elastic-like dough. And again, if you're making sandwich bread, you want to use more flour, so closer to 4 cups of flour. I will say you might want to experiment and find your preference on this, because I have made it before with only 3 cups of flour, and it did produce a nice moist loaf. It was just more difficult to work with less flour. If you're making pizza dough, naan bread, pita bread, or a nice dinner loaf that you kind of want to be more like ciabatta bread, you can get away with kneading your dough in the KitchenAid for around 2 to 5 minutes, after which point you can do a series of stretching and folding. Stretching and folding takes the place of kneading. However, it will give you a more airy bread that has more pockets. Something I've got to mention is this is a better method for things like English muffins as well. Anything that you want to have pockets and holes in. If you choose the stretch and fold method, you can actually do that in your KitchenAid. Just turn your KitchenAid off, and about 20 minutes later, turn it on for a few seconds, then turn it off, and then repeat the process around 3 to 4 more times. Or of course, you can do it the traditional way. With kneading and stretching and folding, you're essentially doing kind of the same thing with both. And the mistake a lot of people make when they're making bread is they don't get this consistency. So you see how this is, it's elasticy. It's not quite as elastic. See how it broke? We want it to stretch further. You want this to be more like elastic. And that is the purpose of kneading, and it's the purpose of stretching and folding, is to create this tension in the dough so that you have your bread consistency. Otherwise, if you don't have this, it's more like a cake consistency. So we're gonna let this knead a little bit longer. We could let it knead longer. We could also just let it sit and let it sit for about 10 minutes and then knead it for maybe like, I don't know, maybe like 3 minutes would probably do the trick. But the point is, and the reason we do this is to essentially activate the gluten. Again, there's a variety of ways to go about this. If you let it sit, it softens the gluten and helps to get it activated. And then with very minimal stirring, you can get this nice elastic consistency. You can just stir it for a really long time. That's another way to get it. You can let it sit and then do the stretch and the folds. That's another way. In this scene, I'm showing you what you're looking for. You want a little bit of the buoyancy. I could have let this knead for a little bit longer, but this is essentially what you're looking for, is the buoyancy like this and the elasticity. I'm going to show you how I do the stretching and folding. This is the first round of stretching and folding. So the dough is a little bit tense and tight. It will become much more loose the more times that I do this and the longer that it rises. Once again, stretching and folding is really good if you have a more wet dough. If you're making a sandwich bread with more flour, you can probably just skip the stretching and folding and just go with kneading. Okay, here I'm going to show you a little trick that I've learned to do when I want the bread to be a little more stretchy. I kind of just take it, swing it, and beat it on the countertop, and that actually works really well to get the dough to be more stretchy. I especially like to do that for baguettes and French bread. Another thing is you do not need to do a prolonged kneading process if you intend to ferment your dough in the refrigerator for a day or two. If you intend to keep your dough in the refrigerator and pull it out as needed, you can just completely skip kneading for the most part and go straight to the stretch and folds. All right, what you see me doing in these scenes is just creating some tension, and I'm going to let this do the first rise. Let's talk about the ways to let your bread rise. There are a couple different ways that you can go about this. Once you finish kneading or the stretch and folds or the combo, it's time to let the bread rise. The longer you let it rise, the more the gluten has time to do its thing and the more digestible it becomes. You can let the bread rise for up to 4 and 5 days in the refrigerator, taking it out as you need it, like I do. If you do it that way, it may need several hours to warm up and actually rise, depending on the temperature in your home. Alternatively, immediately after you're done mixing it, you can let it go straight to rising. You can let it rise in a warm place, of course, until it has about doubled. And once it is doubled, you can form it into your loaves and let it double again. I do want to state, you can skip the first rising session. So once you've made your bread, mixed it, kneaded it, you can put it directly into a loaf pan. This may produce a slightly more dense loaf though. Also, it is healthier to let it rise, form it into the loaf, and let it rise a second time. So allow it to have a first rise in a bowl on the counter or in the refrigerator. You can do that as well. Let it double, then form it into your loaf, put it in your loaf pan, let it double again, or almost double, and then pop it into a preheated oven. I like to bake mine at 400 degrees until it's between 190 and 200 degrees. I would like to talk about just a few tips and tricks that I have found that help make a more successful sourdough journey. Let's say you want to use your sourdough and it hasn't doubled. As long as it's room temperature and as long as it's bubbly like this has been fed not very long ago, but it has not doubled, as you can see. But if you need to use it, one way to kind of speed things up and help it along is go ahead, make your sourdough recipe, make your bread, just simply add a little extra sugar. The sugar will help boost the yeast and the fermentation process and speed things up. With your starter, a great way to tell if it has doubled and is ready to use is to put it in a jar and put a rubber band around the starting point, or use a marker and mark the starting point. If you use whole wheat and only whole wheat, your bread will not rise quite as high and it will produce a more heavy loaf. Gluten-free flour and rice flour is way more non-stick and easier to work with. So if you are forming things like hot dog buns, hamburger buns, or anything really, even if it's just a simple loaf, it's easier to use gluten-free or rice flour than it is to use regular unbleached or wheat flour. In my experience, stretching and folding generally always makes a better loaf of bread, no matter what you're making. If you're making things like hot dog buns or hamburger buns, it works better to use the recipe with only 3 cups of flour. Also, as you're making them, don't forget they're gonna rise. You want them to double, so make them much smaller than the actual size you want them to be. There are a lot of sourdough bells and whistles that people think they need to have before they can do sourdough. And I just want to state, most of it you don't need. I've never had a banneton. I've never had a bread cloche. I feel that the cast iron Dutch oven that I've always had, works perfectly for those dinner loaves or bread boule if you want to get technical. I find that my Pampered Chef stoneware and cookie sheets and my bread pans, as well as just a regular cast iron Dutch oven, do the trick perfectly. 2 things that I found really do help and are handy to have around when making bread, though, are number 1, a bread lame and a bench scraper or a counter scraper. So you guys, I started making bread 35 years ago. I was 10 when a neighbor asked if I would be interested in making them bread. And so my mom started teaching me how to make bread. And all these years I've made bread without a bread lame until last year. So I was making bread 34 years without a bread lame. This is the one tool that I will say I highly recommend. It does make scoring the bread much, much easier. And the last tool that I highly recommend is, of course, a bread stirring machine. Please note, though, that KitchenAid just released an announcement. They recommend not using their newer KitchenAids for more than 2 minutes on speed 2. So clearly, the KitchenAids are not your best bread machines. I would highly recommend looking into Bosch. They've been around forever, and I've only ever heard great things about Bosch bread machines. So what I like to do, and what this is I make up huge batches of that exact bread recipe that I just told you, and I store it in the refrigerator until I'm ready to use it. I will pull out the bread dough like this. Right here, I pulled this out just a few hours before I wanted to start using it. So with these today, I'm just making some pizzas, tortillas. There's just so many different things. You can make yourself crackers. I did a tutorial on crackers about a year ago. So right now I am just getting this bread ready for the kids for lunch today. It's gonna be pizza and tortillas. What I like to do though is I like to make up about 4 batches of that bread recipe, and I use that for pizza night. And I also make up about 4 batches, and those will be for bread for the week. And again, I mix up, since there's 10, I usually have around 10 cups of sourdough starter. That's gonna make about 10 batches of that bread. And what I like to do is I just make it all up at once. I make some bread the first day, but then with the rest of the batches, I just put it in the fridge in a large container, and I pull it out through the week as I need it. When I do it that way, I do not knead each batch for 10 minutes. I only knead it for about 2 to 5 minutes in the KitchenAid. And this way, we're able to have, like fresh baked bread almost any night of the week that we want it. And it's sourdough. Since it's been in the refrigerator, it's had more of a long ferment too, which means it's more digestible than it would be if it were fermented with a quicker, faster, short ferment time. So it's actually healthier to make it up in large quantities and do a slow fermentation process in the refrigerator. What I had here was about a full last batch of bread, the last batch of bread I had in the fridge, and I divided it up. Now, I had it sitting out for about 5 hours. It's still a little chilly though. And what I did is I formed them. Now, I can't really roll these out right now, they'd be too tough. So I want to let them rise for a little bit longer so that they're easier to maneuver and roll out. Because like I said, if I roll them out right now, they're a little cold and they would be too difficult to roll out. I need to let them rest for a while. These ones here are going to be tortillas. This one's going to be the pizza dough. These tortillas, they also could be rolled as naan bread though. So could the pizza dough. There are no hard, fast rules when it comes to this. You can use it however you want. However, if you are making tortillas, I do find that more fat in the dough makes them better, makes them more pliable and last longer. And with pizza crust, no fat in the dough seems to make them better. So that is one variation. But again, you don't have to do that. Like, I'm not doing that today. If you're looking for a fast and easy lunch for like your homeschool day, you can make up a whole bunch of these, however many you need, and just cook them like this on both sides. And then on the day you want to use them, just have your pizza sauce ready to go, like prepare it in advance. And you can put all the toppings on and just toast them in the oven. Super fast, super easy lunch. One of my subscribers asked, what causes gummy sourdough? There can be a couple reasons for this. In fact, I have had this problem in times past and I did not know what caused it until I did a little bit of research. I've always known that gumminess can be caused by cutting the bread while it's still really hot from the oven. You want to wait after you get your bread out of the oven, let it cool before you cut it, because if you cut it too soon, it will be gummy. But let's say you've done that and it's still gummy. What is causing it then? According to my research, this can be caused by over or under proofing. By that, I mean if you did not let your bread rise long enough, or if you let it rise too long. The nice thing about sourdough is it's pretty gracious and you have a lot more time to work with on both sides of the equation when it comes to the rising time. With yeast bread, it's pretty exact. You have to catch it right when it's ready, and if you wait too long, it's just too long. Sourdough is a little more gracious. Another reason that you can get gummy sourdough though is if your starter was not quite ready. So if your starter wasn't active enough, if it wasn't bubbly enough, and if it hadn't risen enough and you used it too soon, this can cause a gummy loaf of bread. I didn't know this till recently, but apparently if you wait too long and your sourdough starter falls, it can also cause a gummy loaf. Another person asked the question about what to do when the bread is rising and it spreads out too much and is difficult to score. If your bread is spreading out too much, it could be because of a couple different factors. One, it could be because there's not enough flour. It could also be that there was not enough tension built up in the dough as you were forming. So more stretch and folds and building more tension will help with that. And lastly, if you overproof or let your bread rise for too long, it will also do that. Another person asked about freezing the dough. Absolutely, you can freeze the dough and bring it out before you're ready to use it. You can freeze it before the first bulk fermentation or the second one. I love to make cinnamon rolls, form them, and then pop them in the freezer to pull out for Sundays and Saturdays. You can pull them out the night before, and by morning they will be thawed and risen and ready to put in the oven in most cases. Some subscribers have talked about having crummy and crumbly bread that is super crummy and falling apart with not a lot of air pockets and it being super dense. This would be generally from not kneading for long enough or not doing stretch and folds long enough. Also, using other kinds of flours like einkorn, spelt, wheat, all of those are going to produce a more crumbly and dense bread. If you're not making a sandwich loaf and you're using a Dutch oven, yes, you want to preheat it before you put the bread in it, because what that does, and also by having a lid on it after you put the bread in, what it does is when the bread hits that really hot heat, it helps give it an extra bounce and an extra rise. Some people have complained that their starter has developed mold after a few days. If this happens, it can be for a couple of reasons. One, it could be too cold in your house and you need to put your starter in a warmer spot. But another reason could be because you actually have mold spores growing somewhere in your house. That's a disturbing thought to think of, but that is one of the reasons that your sourdough could be developing mold. Some people have asked, what is sourdough supposed to smell like when it is first getting started? It doesn't smell great. It does smell kind of strange. I mean, there is a fermentation process that's happening, and that generally never smells wonderful. One of the ways you know it's good, though, is when it does start producing the bubbles. When those bubbles start forming, that's when you know that the good bacteria has taken root. I believe the last question was, is sourdough actually healthier for you? Is it easier to digest? Yes, it is. Although it still has gluten in it, the gluten is more broken down than it would be in a traditional yeast bread, and it is far easier to digest. The fermentation process kind of unlocks the nutrients, so you get more nutrition out of your sourdough bread, since the nutrients are more assimilable. The fermentation process also lowers the glycemic index, so it won't spike your blood sugar like regular bread will. There is a probiotic and prebiotic process that takes place while it is fermenting. However, the probiotics are destroyed by the heat when you bake the bread. The prebiotics, however, are still there. Sourdough is not for people that have celiac or a complete gluten intolerance, but for those that are just slightly sensitive to wheat, generally they do find that sourdough is a lot easier and oftentimes doesn't give them any of the same problems that eating traditional wheat bread does. On the note of gluten-free sourdough, I do have a gluten-free sourdough book. The recipes in it are absolutely delicious. It is more of an intermediate to advanced process making gluten-free sourdough, though. I will link to the cookbook below, and I will say that I do not like gluten-free bread, but gluten-free sourdough is a whole nother ballgame, and it is actually very delicious. I've had so many questions about stretching and folding, so I am going to do that for a second here. First, I'm going to do some bagels. So this is some bread dough that we made the day before, and I got up early this morning, so it's still dark outside. That's why the lighting is not good. Anyways, I am going to make some bagels here, and I'm just going to speedily show you how I do that. Then I'm going to show you some stretching and folding. When I pulled this out of the refrigerator, it was very cold, so I let it warm up for about 15 minutes. Then I separated what I wanted to use for bagels, and I let that set in a warm spot to soften so I could work with it. This video is already getting to be pretty long, so I'm not going to show you all the details of how I make the bagels. I do have another video where I did bagels, and I will also do another more in-depth one in the future, so be sure you subscribe, because I usually do sourdough videos or sourdough recipes in my videos fairly often. And although I won't be showing you what I'm doing with these, I will tell you briefly. I'm going to set these aside and let them rise. Okay, so here's the scene where you've seen they rose for about an hour. Now I'm just going to pop them in the freezer until I'm ready to make bagels with them. Making bagels is really fun. You essentially just boil them in some salt and soda water for a couple minutes, and then you bake them. All right, this is a super high hydration bread I'm working with right here. This only had 3.5 cups of flour in it, so it's almost wet enough to be a ciabatta bread, but it's not completely. I've had so many questions about the stretching and folding, so I just wanted to show you guys that one more time. Right now, I am stretching and folding for a loaf of sandwich bread. I'm just using that same recipe I gave you earlier, and that I'll have in the description below. I'm speeding this up a little bit, but not so much that you can't see what's happening, hopefully. Don't go anywhere, because I will be explaining a little bit more in just a second. this loaf of bread, I'm putting it in one of my bowls to let it rise. I always let it rise in these, and then I will transfer it to my cast iron Dutch oven. I'll show you how that works in just a second. With the loaves of bread that you just saw me handling, those were made last night. They were made at around 9 o'clock last night, and my son made them. Actually, he made 3 batches of bread. As you could see, it was a little sticky, a little hard to handle. These loaves were made with 3½ cups of flour. We skipped the kneading process and we just basically incorporated all of the ingredients, got it all good and mixed, and put it in the refrigerator. At about 5 o'clock this morning, I pulled them out of the refrigerator and I separated some for bagels. With the other 2 loaves, I went through a series of letting it rest. So I let it warm up to room temperature. After it warmed up to room temperature, I started doing stretching and folding. So it took maybe an hour to get it warmed up enough that I could start doing the stretching and folding. So at around 6 o'clock, I started doing this stretching and folding, and then I kind of forgot about it. So this is how gracious sourdough bread can be. I think I only did the stretching and folding maybe once every 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And there was a 1 hour stretch in there between one of the stretching and foldings. I did about 4 stretching and foldings. After the very last one that you just saw, I put it on my warming shelf on my wood cook stove so that it would rise. My house is very warm. What time is it? Okay, it's about almost 11:30 now and they are rising. They'll probably take about an hour to rise or double because of how warm it is in my house. After that, I'm going to bake them. It's been 45 minutes and the bread is almost doubled. I am turning my oven on to preheat and I'm turning it on 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm also making sure the racks are in the correct position before the oven gets hot. Usually I forget to do that. It's a lot easier if you remember to do that before the oven gets hot though. I'm also putting my Dutch oven in the oven because I want it to be getting hot at the same time and I want it to be 400 degrees when I go to put the bread in it. This is a pretty oven, but if I had it to do over again, I would have gotten a convection oven. The gas does not do well with cooking bread. It always burns the bread on the bottom. If anybody out there has tips for how to avoid that in a gas oven, I would love to hear them. So now I am just going to easily transfer the parchment paper and the bread into this pan. It's super easy, a lot easier than other methods would be. By putting this into the really hot pan and then covering it, we're going to be creating steam and it's going to help that bread to rise. I did not do this, but another option you can do is you can put a boiling pan of water in with the bread as it's baking, and that will create steam that will also help the bread to rise. In about 15 minutes, I am going to remove that lid so that that boule or boule can get nice and toasty. So these have baked for approximately 40 minutes. I like to use a thermometer just to check for doneness, because there's just nothing worse than going through all of this trouble to make such a lovely loaf of bread and pulling it out too soon only to find that it's gummy inside. So I don't even chance it. I use a thermometer. I pop that in there, and when it gets to between 190 to 200 degrees, that's when you know it's done. I will say there is another method that a lot of people use and that I did use for years. If you knock on it and it sounds hollow, usually it's done. That crust is nice. There are so many things you can make with sourdough starter, from all of the things that I showed you today, but beyond. You can make crackers, bagels, you can make breadcrumbs and croutons with day-old bread. By the way, if you overproof or over-rise bread, a great little trick is to turn it into English muffins. If you have a ton of sourdough discard, you can make sourdough pancakes. And crackers are another thing that you can do with sourdough discard. You can take excess sourdough starter and you can use it to make gravies and sauces and roux. Learning to cook with sourdough can be a bit tricky in the beginning, and it may take you a few times of trial and error to get it figured out. But once you get it figured out, you'll be amazed at how easy it is. Also, it is so much more affordable to make your own bread. I calculated what it would cost for our family if we bought all of our bread products. It would be over $200 a month. And yet I can make the same amount with a mere $30 a month in flour and ingredients. It truly is an art that is worth figuring out and learning how to do for your family for health reasons and for taste reasons as well. I hope this video has been a blessing for you and that it's helped to demystify sourdough. If so, please share this video. Thank you so much for watching to the end.